Hello and welcome to Talking General Practice, the podcast from GP Online. I'm Emma Bower, the editor of GP Online. On the podcast today, I'm joined by Dr Duncan Gooch, a GP in Derbyshire and the chair of the NHS Confederation's Primary Care Network, which represents at-scale primary care organisations. As well as being a GP partner, Duncan also has leadership roles in at-scale primary care organisations in his local area. In this conversation, we talk about the government's 10-year plan for the NHS and what it means for general practice. Duncan shares his thoughts on the new contracts for neighbourhood providers, how they could work alongside the GP partnership model and primary care networks, and why he believes they're not a threat to the partnership model. Duncan also offers his views on what practices can do to prepare for the move to neighbourhood working, the role technology and data will play in how general practice works in the future, and how he believes working at scale can help GPs to have greater influence in their local healthcare systems and provide support for individual practices, as well as how some of these organisations could take on ICB functions in the future. Before we start, just a quick message from our colleagues on MIMS Learning. In-person learning is a vital part of keeping up to date, enabling GPs and other health professionals to learn with colleagues, ask questions of expert speakers and benefit from networking. MIMS Learning's event page gives you details of all the general practice focused learning events, which will provide you with practical take-home points for your practice, along with CPD certification. Visit mimslearning.co.uk/pages/events to find out more. I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast now by Dr Duncan Gooch, who's a GP in Derbyshire and the chair of the NHS Confederation's Primary Care Network. Duncan is the managing partner and clinical director of Erewash Health Partnership, a consortium of practices that provides healthcare services to over 100,000 people. He also helped form the Derbyshire General Practice Alliance in 2018, which has evolved into the Derby and Derbyshire GP Provider Board, an early example of a provider collaborative. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Duncan.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to that.
Firstly, before we get into talking about the 10-year plan, which is what we're mainly here to talk about, can you just explain a bit about what your role as chair of the NHS Confederation Primary Care Network involves? What is it you actually do?
So I spend half my week seeing patients. I'm a GP partner, and then the rest of the time I have a variety of leadership roles, and one of those chairs the primary care network at the NHS Confederations, and it's a network that's made up of more than 220 at-scale primary care organisations. As chair, what I do is that there's a policy team that sits in the network, and what we do is we listen and try and represent the interests and the views of our members. We try and connect them with other people. We try and get them into really interesting places to have the type of conversations that are on their mind, that feel important to them, so that they can try and shape and change the world around them so that it suits what they want and what they want to do in service of their patients.
We're speaking just after the 10-year plan has been published. Obviously, it's a pretty major development for the NHS and general practice. I mean, what did you make of the plan? What would you say the most significant thing in there was for general practice?
It feels really positive to have a vision moving forward, and I think something positive to then be able to debate the pros and the cons of. And so I don't think we should ignore that just as something. I think the really positive things from a general practice perspective, that commitment to preserving the GP partnership model, but also in acknowledgement that other models can exist where they're needed or where they're wanted locally. I think the concept of neighbourhood health in this way that's building around the needs of communities and the needs of populations, involving multiple partners to try and improve the experience of people living, feels really valuable. So the neighbourhood contracts that will seek to do that, as we hear more about them, feels like really positive things coming out of the 10-year plan.
You're a GP partner and you've seen the plan as very much protecting the partnership model, but with these new options that could be available. So just for people listening, the government's proposing 2 new contracts, one for neighbourhood providers across a population of about 50,000 people, and the second a multi-neighbourhood provider covering populations of 250,000 people. So some of the concerns I've heard from other GPs is they fear that this could be the end of the partnership model. You don't see it as that, do you? How do you feel those contracts will work in reality?
I am a partner, as you described, and so I obviously see a lot of strength in that model. I think the sense of accountability that partners feel, I think the sense of buy-in and connection with the local community is really strong. That's not to say that can't exist in other organisations, but to see that and have that recognised as a real strength of what we're doing is really important. But it isn't right for every area and it isn't right for every group of GPs. And so actually recognizing that in some areas they will choose alternative models which will support different career paths, different delivery models, is something we should probably support. We should be looking at finding the model that suits the local area and provides the right set of services for the population rather than an arbitrary fixation on a single delivery model. So there's nothing that I've read or seen that would suggest that the partnership model isn't more than capable of being able to deliver. Perhaps the areas where it's going to come into most difficulty is when we get to really significant scale and significant amounts of risk attached to it, because the law that sits around it perhaps doesn't limit the liability in a way that might be required for significant risk sharing to occur. But if we think about delivery on the ground, what's important to patients, continuity of care, the partnership model itself is well suited to delivery for that.
You said that in some parts of the country it might be that these new contracts come into play. Do you have any thoughts about, not naming specific areas, but kind of traits or something of an area where that might happen? Is it likely to be areas where they've really struggled to recruit GP partners? Is that the first sort of place you see these things happening?
So I think that local condition, what's the retention rates like? What's the demographic? What's the age? That will have a contributing factor. I actually wonder whether there's something about the pre-existing relationships with other providers in the area. So if there's a historically positive relationship with an acute trust or a community provider in which you've been seeing drift towards increasingly collaborative working over time, then that feels, with the sort of buy-in from the ground, like it would be a good opportunity to explore other models, not as a mandated model of change, but as a natural progression of an evolution that's already been occurring.
You talked about hospitals. People I've spoken to, they don't really like the idea of hospitals necessarily running neighbourhood health, because obviously hospitals cover big footprint, perhaps quite far away from some of those local communities. What's your thoughts about that if hospitals end up becoming, in some areas, the place that's in charge of developing this neighbourhood health service?
It's probably the most common concern that I hear from the members, actually, is that a description where they might lose control, where they might not be able to make the right choices for their patients and for the population that they serve because it would be being controlled by someone else. So acknowledging that, it feels really important, and it's something that's creating concern and anxiety. And it doesn't feel right that an acute trust that was remote and distant from a population that it was serving should make all the decisions. So that probably just tells us that existing decision-making infrastructure would need to change and would need to evolve. So I think to take a position of absolutism around some of this probably isn't helpful, because we have such a large amount of variation. What's clear is that primary care has an awful lot to bring to the table. It has this sort of amazing connection with the population that it serves. Its clinical leadership is embedded throughout it. The idea of population health management, the idea of allocating resource to where it's needed. These are all things that are sort of part of the DNA of what general practice is, and actually what primary care is more broadly. And that's something really special to be able to bring to the table of an acute trust or a community trust or a mental health trust in how they might work together. So to think that an organisation that doesn't understand a culture adequately, that perhaps hasn't had a lot of experience, could go and run it, I think is almost trying to play into those anxieties. It wouldn't ever be able to do that without substantial change and without building that capability.
There will be places, though, where hospitals do end up sort of leading this, just for whatever local circumstances. Could that model work, providing there's a strong GP voice in how things are developed?
What we really need is to find a way of distributing funding, distributing resource to where it makes most difference. And we know that finding the way of getting it into the community, finding a way of building a model of care that's heavily based in the principles of primary care. So that coordination, comprehensiveness, continuity is really important. Now, if there's a way of achieving that through a vertically integrated model with a hospital trust, then that's fantastic. We should embrace that because it meets our common goal, this ambition to try and create a left shift. But it's not to say that that's the single right method of doing or that it's a single wrong method. I think focusing on what we're trying to achieve by that vertical integration and finding a way of doing it with the appropriate leadership, and probably more importantly for me, with the appropriate buy-in from the ground, from the front line and from the patients themselves, is what's going to make this successful.
One thing that's quite interesting about all of this is obviously that neighbourhood provider contract that I mentioned earlier, that covers sort of a similar population size as primary care networks do. Do you see that contract eventually replacing the PCN contract in some areas? What role do you think PCNs are going to play as this neighbourhood NHS evolves?
PCNs across the country have been really terrific in what they've done. They've shown and demonstrated the ability of primary care leadership at a local level to make change, to make differences, to recruit, supervise, support, train a whole new workforce. They've done some really incredible work on reducing health inequalities, delivery of the COVID vaccination programme. Whatever comes into the future certainly can't throw away that amazing work. It has to be built on what's come before it. So the nervousness that I might have as a PCN clinical director to think, I'm worried here that all of this hard work and all of this investment I put into my local community might be thrown away into something different. Well, that's just not going to happen, and it can't happen because we need to build on what we've already created, not waste a lot of time with creating new structures and new governance. We need to build on what we've got, use that foundation of PCNs that are working so successfully in so many places, and use that as the platform into these neighbourhood providers.
You talked earlier about risk. That is kind of a problem when it comes to moving services out of hospitals and into the community. Do you think that more primary care networks are going to have to become companies and set themselves properly up on that sort of footing as this all changes?
You're right. So primary care networks aren't a legal thing. They're a network that comes out of the GP contract. There are advantages and disadvantages to that model. If we start talking about significant shifts of resource, of staffing, the risk starts to mount. That requires quite robust governance to sit around it. And the governance that exists within a company and the protections that also exist within a company are really valuable. So the idea that we collectively can lead and can have the right governance sat around these neighbourhoods to be able to take risk, but actually really importantly to deliver the right outcomes for our population feels really critical. And doing that within an ethically sound way is exceptionally important.
The other thing that's a big part of what could happen for general practice in the coming years is a new GP contract. There wasn't loads in the plan about the new GP contract. One of the things the government has promised is to overhaul GP funding to ensure deprivation is better reflected in how funding's allocated to practices. What else would you and the rest of the NHS Confederation Primary Care Network, what else would you like to see in a new GP contract?
The Cahill reform is really important.
Yeah.
The fact that deprivation and the health inequalities that exist as a result of inadequate distribution of resources across general practice is really difficult. And the legacy of it is going to take quite a long time to come through and be sorted out. Personally, we've been stuck in a position of a transactional approach to a contract, which is often measuring activity and number of things done without really focusing on what we're trying to do, which is to improve the outcomes for patients and to deliver a good experience of a service. We're not seeing those things that feel really important being adequately connected within the previous contracts. And so from a contract reform perspective, I think a move away from transactional output measurements into a way of trying to tie it into what we're trying to achieve and the outcomes we're trying to achieve is really important. The red tape challenge elements to a contract feel really important. As a GP that spends a lot of my time, it's exceptionally frustrating for the hurdles that are put in my place to just try and support an individual with their health. Multiple referral forms, people bouncing in between various services. It just doesn't make sense for the people that we're seeing. There's something around liability, which we've spoken about in the context of risk, but some of the behaviours that I see amongst my partner colleagues are driven out of the significant risk that they take on in the unlimited partnerships that they sit in. So, allowing limited liability partnerships, as an example, to hold contracts would feel like a way forward in trying to help create the environment which is more supportive of the degree of risk taking. Probably finally, and it's one that I find really interesting. I'm a GP trainer, so I do a lot of supervision and support of not just GP trainees, but the wider multidisciplinary team. It would be really nice to see some sort of recognition of the additional clinical supervision, the support around retention. So something about how we help build that workforce, retain that workforce, and really grow it into what we need it to be. And that would be a really nice thing to see within the contract as well.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a lot in the 10-year health plan, and we've talked a bit already about at-scale general practice, and obviously you've got quite a lot of experience of that in your career. So I mentioned at the start, you're the managing partner and clinical director of Erewash Health Partnership, which is a consortium of practices. How is that set up, and how does it benefit the practices that are part of it?
Our journey to begin started in about 2013, 2014. So we started as a GP federation in response to the AQP threat that we thought was around us from the enhanced services. And then Erewash got a vanguard status in the new care models as a multi-specialty community provider. And so I was leading some, I think we called it GP engagement work. What I was trying to do is get local GPs into a room together to talk about things that are important, to see how we might want to evolve and grow into the future. And I was trying to come up with some slightly out there suggestions, not because I thought that they were right, but because I wanted to stretch people's thinking to see where they were on a set of continuum. So 2 or 3 months into the Vanguard program I suggested, why don't we all merge into a single organisation? To which the collective response was, actually, that's not the worst idea in the world. So it took 2 or 3 years for us to grow and create all the arrangements. We were created out of a reason to do 3 things. So one of them was that we felt slightly safer and more resilient by being together. So we felt as if we could support each other. We thought there were opportunities to run the business more efficiently. The other thing we wanted to do was, so we're equidistant between 2 hospitals. The community that we serve don't often travel large distances, so they quite like staying locally. So what we wanted to do was to be able to offer more services to the local community and just do more locally. So we thought by coming together, we can now work at scale to be able to do that. And then the third thing we wanted to be able to achieve was to try and influence the world around us. So we wanted to be able to describe what we wanted for general practice and have that listened to. So we formed a single partnership across multiple practices in 2018 and have been sort of building and growing since then.
And how does the GP provider board, how does that link in with the consortium? What's different about that?
This was a couple of years later in thinking. I'd made a couple of observations. So one was that those that were doing GP leadership at a level above their own practice, people just didn't know each other's names, and they certainly didn't know what each other was thinking, and they weren't able to provide support to each other, and they weren't able to network with each other. So reason number one was coming from this observation of, if we bring people together, we can create a slightly nicer environment in which to try and provide some leadership on behalf of general practice. The second observation was, at the time, the CCG was doing the winter plan for general practice. And I was then sat in my GP organisation thinking, I'm the one that's responsible and accountable for these plans that are being written on my behalf, but we haven't got that connection made right. So I'm going to be responsible for the delivery of something, but I'm not involved in writing it. And so how can I try and take a bit more control over what the future looks like for for general practice in our area. So, and actually that was quite a strong motivator for most of the GPs in our system. So it was those two things that really drove us to come together. And it started as a pretty loose network. And then over time, the importance of having some governance started to grow. So we created a small board, and then with time we formalized the governance. We became a company, and it became increasingly structured as an organization, and then changed its name into a general practice provider board with time.
There's a lot of talk about these provider collaboratives. I know it's something that the NHS Confederation are very interested in as well. You know, they're running a series of webinars about these for your members, about how to set them up. There's been a lot of discussion about the fact that these sort of collaboratives, once they're set up and established, they could be the kind of place where some of the functions of an ICB, as they change over the next 18 months or so, some of those functions could move to these provider collaboratives. Is that how you see yours developing? Do you think you will start taking on some of those things as ICBs reduce in size?
Yes, it's long been my view that a lot of function that sat initially within commissioning, clinical commissioning groups, but then into ICBs could be done and might be better done with a stronger connection to provision. So that belief that I've held for quite a few years, I don't think has fundamentally changed. I think what's important is the how. There are a lot of organisations that could take on that function. It's how we do it and how we connect that to those that need it being done. So it would be my belief and my preference that if we have a primary care digital group, the people that it's affecting, so the practices and the primary care networks, have a really strong say in what that looks like and how that works. So for me, the idea of the primary care provider collaboratives owning the space in which they have a really strong connection to frontline delivery, and they are able to provide what's needed to make the job easier and to improve outcomes for patients is really important. And that's, I guess, the unique selling points that these collaboratives bring. The embedded clinical leadership, the connection of what's actually happening on the ground. I think there's something really important about the culture that exists within primary care. So I'm a GP partner, and my unit of time is my career. So 5-year reorganisations and pilots that last 2 or 3 years aren't something that lands very well within the culture of primary care. We are long-standing, long-existing organisations with a significant amount of memory and a really strong and long-standing commitment to a community. We're not going anywhere. Culturally, that's really, really important because it means that we need to engage in a way that lasts for a long time. And we need to engage in a way that isn't just some new, fancy, bright light that attracts us. We need to do something that connects to our purpose and really connects to what we're trying to achieve. And that's where the strength of general practice and more broadly primary care leadership coming together with that commonality is something really positive to bring into a system.
The NHS Confederation, the primary care network you mentioned there, you said that you were representing primary care at scale. I mean, do you have a sense at all about how widespread these collaboratives are? Do most parts of the country have them, or are there some areas that are going to be really starting from scratch on this if they want to get something like this up and running?
From a Confed perspective, we've done a bit of mapping, and I think we're up to 31 that we've identified around the country. So pretty widespread if we think about there being 42 ICSs already. But they're not the only method by which primary care comes together. So we've got some really strong GP federations, we've got some strong super partnerships. So the idea of creating a provider collaborative isn't the only solution to the problem of trying to bring a really strong voice of primary care into the leadership space across systems. They're actually, I don't think that difficult to create because most people quite like being sociable. And most people quite like listening to each other and talking to each other and finding strength in common purpose. The difficulty is in sustaining it. I think it's on us, and our challenge is to make sure that the value that they bring into a system is seen and recognised by the system itself, the other providers, the commissioner, to see that value and support it.
Derby and Derbyshire have been highlighted by the government in all this stuff around the 10-year plan as kind of early adopters of neighbourhood working, both in the plan itself and in the announcement about pilots that they're wanting to look at. What's been successful about this in your area? How are you doing neighbourhood working and how has it changed things?
The approach that's been taken is a really nice approach in which it talks about what we're trying to achieve. So there's a real temptation for people to run straight into the detail of what a contract says and then deliver against exactly what a contract says. Or there's a temptation to then say, well, what's the precise governance mechanism? What does that look like? And actually, the approach that's been taken over a number of years is to try and provide as much freedom as close to delivery as possible. So to say, this is the outcome that we want you to achieve, and this is how we're going to bring resources together. So we can help you bring together, and we get the buy-in from senior members of an organisation. We can help bring mental health. We can help bring community services. We can help bring social care. We can help bring the voluntary sector together to coalesce around this problem and then try and find the solution. So allowing local determination, local leadership, responding to what local assets you have has been a really successful part of this. The long-standing higher purpose to say, this is what we're trying to achieve. And we believe that by setting the right cultural tones and setting the right outcome, we will get there. And a real resolute consistency with that over a number of years has helped lead into that sort of integrated neighbourhood working.
Have you had any success with services moving out of hospitals and into the community? Is that something that's happened in your area?
So they're very actively working on the women's health hubs, but really this is just people that needed some additional support from their GP. So that a GP felt that they needed to make a referral and try and move that into the community. And the work around that looks really, really exciting. The outcome data from the integrated neighbourhood teams looks really impressive. I know a lot of it was quoted in the press releases around the 10-year plan, and we see these numbers with multiple zeros at the end of it. Sometimes forget that each one of those is a person. And for those that might have had a relative that's experienced a hospital admission where there wasn't a huge amount of benefit, it's quite a lot of lives that have been impacted by that improvement and by that shifting of activity out of hospitals into the community.
What do you think GP practices, primary care networks, what should they be doing now to prepare for neighbourhood working? Because it's coming. What steps are the best things for them to do if they're not doing a lot of it at the minute?
So I suspect a lot are doing quite a lot already.
Yeah.
Some of it is to carry on doing what you're doing, because it's pretty awesome. For those that perhaps are either struggling or they're not quite sure what it means, top tip is just to connect with your local partners. So they will be your best allies. Your local voluntary sectors are phenomenal institutions that have been around for so long. And I don't think I've ever found a better ally than our local voluntary sector. I think community trusts, mental health trusts, local government, we have a whole set of partners that exist within all of our communities, all whom really want the same thing. And if we can connect with those, not only do we build the strength of our voice, but we have a much better chance of doing the right thing for our patients. So I mentioned earlier on about this importance of allocating resource to need. So we often hear population health management as an approach being discussed. Really thinking about what are the interventions that are going to make most difference to my population, and how do I do that in a way that's as inclusive as possible? I think working through some of that and building the relationships that are required to do that is what really unlocks our potential locally.
The other big thing, obviously, in the plan is this shift from analogue to digital. And there's a massive focus on tech and AI. Do you think what the government's sort of proposing, do you think it's realistic? Is that something that can happen across the next 10 years, do you think?
It feels like it's realistic. I think the pace of change in technology is pretty incredible at the moment. And I think we're going to go through a revolution over the next 10 years in which we will be delivering and doing things in a different way, because we will respond to that changing environment and the rapid acceleration of technological change. But for us to be able to use it, we need help. So the staff working and doing stuff need to be supported in doing it. And we need to be shown and help understand where the risks and liabilities sit around it, but actually how it can make a difference for what we're doing. It's all very well having some fantastic tech, But if it's not being used or it's not being used in a safe way, then it's somewhat irrelevant. There's probably a challenge around interoperability in this. So with this ambition, we see lots of entrants into a market. So you get lots of new products, not all of whom are great at talking to each other. Like that idea that as we see tech roll out in the NHS and we see this ambition fulfill, it really has to be interoperable. I'm not sure how strongly it came across in the plan. It's in there, but the bit that landed with me most strongly is the opportunity that we have for tech to make people feel more empowered in looking after themselves. The current model is largely, right, you come in for an appointment and we get a member of staff who's trained to do it. There's a huge amount of tech already that could be doing this and extracting some of this information. And if we empowered our population, our communities, our patients to do this, we will really start changing the dynamic of how they then interacted with health services. So the question about, yeah, it feels really realistic, but it actually feels quite an exciting opportunity that if we can sort the training out, sort some of the infrastructure that sits out underneath it, we can start to really build a different relationship with people that we're serving.
Tech's a big thing, but what other changes do you think are needed, to help achieve an integrated neighbourhood NHS? I'm going to ask you about premises here, because obviously that's always a major problem every time I ever talk to any GPs about the future, and practice managers as well. It's one of their bugbears about the future, is that the primary care estate's not great in some parts of the country and there's not enough space for everybody. What else do you think needs to happen around the infrastructure to help this integrated neighbourhood working get off the ground properly?
I think you're completely right, Emma. I think to not discuss estates would be really peculiar, and it would come up in the top 5 issues that I would have if I go and talk with a group of people locally, say, how can we do more? And it's, well, I don't physically have the rooms. We're already hot desking. We're having to use cupboards for things. So finding estate solutions that are sensible and exactly what we need is really important, and finding a way for the government to be able to fund those, so to get the capital investment to improve that, is really critical. Like, there is only so much that we can do by using different models, by utilizing estates to their maximum capacity, by sort of exploiting remote working. If and when we deliver this left shift, as we provide more and more in people's communities, we do need the estates to be able to do that. And that feels really, really important to do. So funding is important. So many individual practices feel really significantly under threat at the moment, and perhaps struggle to get through the week, the month at times. It's going to be really difficult, if not impossible, to build a thriving neighborhood model of delivery without thriving components sitting underneath it. So you're going to need thriving practices. You're going to need thriving community pharmacy and optometry and dentistry and schools and voluntary sector to be able to come together. So from a primary care perspective, thinking about, well, having adequate funding settlements, having the security of contracts that last a reasonable length of time, looking at things like Section 75 arrangements where you can pool budgets with other organisations to try and create a degree of extra flexibility is really important. The data and the IT interoperability and visibility and the way it's used is essential here. I spend all of my time when I'm interacting with patients, the only thing on my mind is trying to understand them. But I can also have more information about them that will help me understand them. And that might be in ways that they don't yet know and that I don't yet know. So our access to data, the data sharing, and then the management of the risk associated with data sharing at a small practice level is a really key enabler to this. So I can be fantastic at trying to understand an individual patient, but that can be made even better if I have a really good set of information about that individual from a variety of sources as well.
There's going to be a new workforce plan later this year. What do you hope to see in that plan?
The workforce in primary care responds to what's available locally.
Yeah.
And so actually a workforce plan is really, really important because it tells you what you're going to build and what's required from the future for you. Most people are responding to what's available to them at the time. And so the balance between the reality of now and what might come in the future feels like it's a really, really important balance. The role of general practitioners within the delivery is critical and really important. They provide a really unique skill set within the delivery of a neighbourhood, an expert generalist, and he's able to manage risk in a really significant way and is able to provide senior clinical decision making and senior supervision. So I don't think they're alone in their delivery. In fact, I know they're not alone in the delivery. So having a diverse workforce, ideally that's then representative of the community that it's serving and is built around the needs of that community, is how we're going to be successful in delivering this. So I think the workforce has been evolving as it's needed to, but it's going to have to carry on doing that, and it's going to have to carry on doing it in that type of way.
The last thing I just wanted to ask is, I mean, do you feel positive about the future? Do you think in 10 years' time, general practice will look a lot different than it does now?
I'm mega positive all the time, partly because we have to be, because I'm going to be here in 10 years' time, and I want the world to be a positive place for my kids and for myself. And I'm really optimistic for general practice. Because I really, really believe in what it stands for. And I believe in what all of primary care stands for. So that first contact care that's comprehensive, coordinated, continuous and person-centred, that's how we deliver high quality healthcare for our populations. And so we have no choice but to succeed and to see it in a positive way and to continue fighting and building for what that future looks like.
All right, that's brilliant. That's a good place to leave it, I think, Duncan. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Thank you.
Oh, thanks a lot for having me, Emma.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks again to Duncan and thank you for listening. I'll be back next week for our regular news review, so please do join me then. In the meantime, don't forget you can keep up to date with all the latest news affecting general practice and access lots of other resources on our website at GPonline.com.